We've now come to the last video outlining Nagel's position in his book, The View from Nowhere. And in this video, we'll look at Chapter 4, The Objective Self, which I think offers a nice completion to the videos that have come before. If you feel so inclined, I highly encourage you to read on ahead. There's much more in the book that we're not going to be covering here, but I've hoped I've given you enough of a basis to help make your way through it yourself. In this chapter, Nagel asks the question, how can it be that one of the people in the world is me? A brief note though before we begin. Throughout this video, I will be using the initials NP to refer to myself from the objective standpoint, from the outside, to the particular person that I am, with his particular history, character traits, dispositions, etc. The person, NP, who I am connected to in the objective order. In the text, Nagel uses his own initials, TN, to refer to himself from this objective view. But I've placed my own initials, NP, in brackets in their place in order to avoid confusion. The general point here is that we can all do this. We can all have the thought that generates the metaphysical puzzle that we are addressing in this video. So feel free to mentally swap out my initials or Nagel's with your own when thinking through this particular philosophical problem. In the previous chapters, we saw that via conception of mental objectivity, Nagel admitted into the objective order subjective mental processes, minds, thoughts, feelings, as well as the people in whom such mental events occur. This conception of mental objectivity allows us to think of essentially and irreducibly subjective processes as themselves belonging to the objective order. But a further problem still persists. Even though we have included these subjective mental processes into our centerless conception of the world, a further fact still seems to be left out of this conception, namely that I am the subject of some such set of subjective processes, that I am one of these persons who exists within the objective order. What kind of fact is that? How can I be the particular person that I am? This is the question Nagel is exploring. There are, unsurprisingly, two questions here that are generated from two types of conception available to beings like us. From the objective standpoint, the question is, how can the world described from the centerless view accommodate the fact that one of the persons in the world is me? Given a complete description of the world from the centerless view, all of its facts, including all of the people in it, quote, something has been left out. Something absolutely essential remains to be specified, namely which of them I am. From the subjective standpoint, the question is, how can I be a person at all? The relations that I have to NP seem to be accidental and arbitrary. How can I be this particular person as opposed to some other person? I see the world through NP's eyes, but that seems accidental and arbitrary. Why do I see the world through this particular set of eyes and not some other set of eyes? How can I be an individual person at all? So the two questions here are, one, how can NP be me? That's the problem which arises from the objective standpoint. And two, how can I be NP? That's the problem that arises from the subjective standpoint. To begin with the first question, how can NP be me? We approach the issue from the objective side, from the perspective of the centerless conception. A centerless view apprehends the world from no particular point of view, the world conceived from nowhere. I can apprehend persons, a detailed description of their histories, experiences, and characteristics, and yet I still seem to be missing something. How can any of these persons be the locus of a particular consciousness? How can one of these persons, NP in particular, be me? Nagel writes, the fact that one of these persons is the locus of my consciousness, the point of view from which I observe and act in the world, seems to be a fact that can't be accommodated by a centerless view of the world. The centerless view contains an individual born at a certain time, to certain parents, with a specific physical and mental history, etc. but it is a further fact that this person is me. The only way to speak of this is by speaking about my consciousness. It's a truth that can only be understood in the first person. Therefore, it's a truth that can't be understood from the centerless third person view. One way of answering this question might be to say that being me is an objective property of the person NP. The problem is that if we include that property in our objective conception of the world, we can still ask the question, which of these persons am I? Because including the property of being mine doesn't tell me anything about which one of those persons is in fact me. It is only from the first person perspective that we can express this fact. But there seems to be no room for this first personal fact in our objective conception of the world. It seems like, quote, the world cannot contain irreducibly first person facts. And again, if this problem has a solution, it must be one which brings the subjective and objective conceptions of the world into harmony. Nagel writes, I shall argue that it provides a clear example of the ineliminability of indexicals from a complete conception of the world, and that it also reveals something about each of us. Now, one might object to all of this by arguing that the statement, I am NP, is really devoid of significant content. Quote, only someone who misunderstands the logic of the first person can believe that I am NP is an important truth that can't be stated without the first person. Because the statement itself might be governed by truth conditions that are expressible without indexicals. I am NP is true if and only if uttered by NP, just as the statement today is Tuesday is true if and only if uttered on Tuesday. When we place such first personal utterances in their context in a centerless view of the world, we can see that they do not depend on further facts that are expressible only in the first person. So while such statements can't be replaced by translations into the third person, quote, the facts that make them true or false are all expressible by such third person statements. The truth conditions of the statement, I am NP, depend on the context of utterance. And this context is provided in the centerless conception of the world. Quote, everything about the use of the first person can be analyzed without using the first person. The centerless objective world can be spoken of from within with the help of expressions such as I, but the facts surrounding the use of the expression are all expressible without it. When I state, I am NP, the truth conditions of the statement can all be expressed from a purely third-person perspective, namely that the one who expresses it was born at such a time, in such a place, is the one who has those particular traits, etc. Nagel writes, this completely general point provides a simple answer to our question, what kind of truth is it that one of the people in the world, NP, is me? It is a quite minimal truth. The statement, I am NP is automatically and uninterestingly true if NP makes it. Once we understand its logic, no further question arises as to what it says. It only seems like there is something mysterious going on here because I can be translated into a statement that doesn't include it. It might be translated into the statement, the person making the statement is NP. But that still includes the indexical, this statement. Indexicals can't be translated into objective terms, but this doesn't point to a deep metaphysical mystery, so the objection runs. The use of indexicals can be completely analyzed by specifying the third-person truth conditions, the context of their utterance, even though the first personal statements themselves can't be translated into third-person terms. But Nagel thinks that this deflationary view of the use of indexicals doesn't make the problem actually go away. We see that it remains when we look at the corresponding puzzle concerning time. Nagel writes, quote, the corresponding semantic point about now would not diffuse someone's puzzlement about what kind of fact it is that a particular time is the present. Quote, there is no room in a fully objective description of the world for the identification of a particular time as the present. The temporal order of events can be described from no point of view within the world, but their presence, pastness, or futurity cannot. Yet the fact that it is now the particular time that it seems to be is a fundamental truth which we cannot do without. The tenseless description of the temporal order is essentially incomplete, for it leaves out the passage of time. Likewise, being able to give impersonal truth conditions for first-personal statements doesn't allow us to make those statements without using the first person. Nagel thinks that the elimination of the first personal thought, I am NP, to be replaced with impersonal truth conditions would leave a significant gap in the world. It is worth noting, however, that the semantic account of I does handle many ordinary cases. When asked, which of you is MP, and I say, I am, nothing unusual is going on here. Ordinary third-person facts about the speaker make the statement, I am, either true or false in this context. It is a different thought, however, that I have when I say to myself, I own that car, or I am his wife. That of all the people in the centerless world, the one I am is NP. That this thinking subject regards the world through the person NP. The statement, hello, I am NP, conveys information that others can express in the third person. For instance, by specifying the conditions under which such an utterance is true, namely that NP is the one who utters it. However, the additional thought, NP is me, expresses further content not captured by the specification of the statement's truth condition. Approaching the problem from the other direction, from the subjective standpoint, the issue is, how can I be anything so specific as a particular person? My being NP seems accidental, but identity can't be accidental. In other words, if I say NP is me, I seem to be expressing a necessary relationship between NP and myself. But from the centerless view, it looks accidental that I'm NP. I could have been anyone else. Nagel writes, as if what I really am, this conscious subject, might just as well view the world from the perspective of a different person. The real me occupies NP, so to speak, or the publicly identifiable person NP contains the real me. From a purely objective point of view, my connection with NP seems arbitrary. When I apprehend the world as centerless, take up the view from nowhere, NP is just one person among countless others. This produces a sense of complete detachment from NP. How could I be anything so specific? By detaching from my particular perspective, I can have a conception of the universe in which NP is an insignificant speck who might have never existed at all. This view is available to all of us. Nagel writes, quote, the self that seems incapable of being anyone in particular is the self that apprehends the world from without rather than from a standpoint within it. But there need not be only one such self. I ordinarily view the world from my perspective, from a certain point of view, quote, using the eyes, the person, the daily life of NP as a kind of window. But this isn't the point of view of the true self. The true self has no point of view and includes NP as just one of the contents of the centerless view. This is what gives rise to the philosophical thought, how can NP be me? And how can I be NP? Speaking of the true self here may seem problematic because we already established in the last chapter that our true nature can't be discovered a priori. That our essential nature may include features not included in the concept of ourselves. The fact that the idea of the subjective self seems detachable from me, from something as distinct as NP, doesn't show that it is in fact distinct or that I don't have other essential characteristics. It doesn't show that I am accidentally related to NP. It does, however, show that there is some essential aspect of me that, quote, has nothing to do with my perspective and position in the world. By taking the individual experiences of NP as data for an objective picture of the world, I abstract the objective self from the person NP. I receive the information about the world from the perspective of NP, and I use it to construct an objective picture of that world from no point of view at all. This is the metaphysical subject, quote, the logical limit that we reach if all the contents of the mind, including its objective thoughts, are thrown into the world as properties of NP. The objective self is the last stage of the detaching subject before it shrinks into an extensionless point. Well, this is an idealization. In a general way, what I do with the information received about the world through the perspective of NP is what I would do, quote, if information about it were reaching me thousands of miles away, not pumped directly into my sensorium, but known from the outside. In principle, the objective self could form its conception of the world from the material provided by any perspective. It doesn't privilege any one perspective over any other. It doesn't privilege what it gathers from its own experience over what it also learns only indirectly. Quote, it is the perspectiveless subject that constructs a centerless conception of the world by casting all perspective into the content of the world. I can detach my objective understanding of the world from the particular point of view that provides the data for that objective understanding. The subject to which the objective view is disclosed is this maximally impersonal objective self. In fact, the nature of the objective self is so abstract and centerless that it doesn't belong to any one person or creature. Nagel writes, the pursuit of objectivity requires the cultivation of a rather austere universal objective self. While we can't free it entirely of infection with a particular human view and a particular historical stage, it represents a direction of possible development toward a universal conception and away from a parochial one. The I that is referred to in the thought, I am NP, is this objective self to whom the centerless conception of reality is disclosed. The reference is still indexical and cannot be eliminated by specifying the conditions under which the assertion would be true. Even though the impersonal conception of the world doesn't make any special reference to NP, it is attached to and develops out of the perspectives of NP. Nagel writes, this also helps to account for the feeling of amazement that is part of the philosophical thought. A strange sense that I both am and am not the hub of the universe. I see myself as its subject or center when I think of the universe, including NP, in purely objective terms, and identify myself simply as the objective self, which is the subject of the conception, rather than as anything within its range, such as a physical organism or the occupant of a particular position in space and time, or the subject of an individual perspective within the world. He is just one of the people in it, and one of them is its center or focal point. So I am both the logical focus of an objective conception of the world and a particular being in that world who occupies no central position whatever. This explains why the thought, I am NP, is not trivial. It identifies an objective fact that corresponds to the thought. NP is an objective self. Quote, I can state a significant identity by referring to myself indexically under that aspect as I, and again under the objective aspect of the publicly identifiable person NP. This doesn't imply anything about who the subject is or if they exist within the world. However, quote, since the objective conception has a subject, the possibility of its presence in the world is there, and it allows me to bring the subjective and objective views together. Until they are brought together in this way, the purely objective conception will leave something out, which is both true and remarkable. The objective self, quote, places us both inside and outside the world and offers us possibilities of transcendence, which in turn create problems of reintegration. The reconciliation of these two aspects of ourselves is a primary philosophical task of human life, perhaps of any kind of intelligent life. In the next video, we'll begin to outline a critique of Nagel's position by offering an alternative view, a view which sees essentially subjective mental states and processes not merely as items that need to be included or reconciled with an objective view, but as living, breathing, agential forms of life themselves that can be engaged with and which can lead us to a deeper first-personal understanding of mind, one which too often falls away in our overzealous pursuit of objectivity. So stick around for the next video, and I hope to see you there.